Dawson's Deputy General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. Tim, thank you for being with us here on France 24. We appreciate your time. What's your take
Pleasure.
on today's hearing in London?
Well, we didn't really learn very much new. We heard arguments that were made during the 5 weeks of the extradition hearing, I suppose you'd say repackaged and represented in the hope that they would gain more traction this time. In particular, Edward Fitzgerald spoke at some length about the issues surrounding whether one can be extradited from the UK to the US for a political crime. It's fairly well exercised that it says on the front page of the extradition treaty between the UK and the US that you can't be extradited on political grounds. Assange's legal team argue that his crimes are undoubtedly political. The Americans, on the other hand, during the hearing, who persuaded the judge in the first round, made the case that the extradition treaty is just that. It's a treaty between governments, not something that has been approved by the legislature. And they said that citizen rights can only be created by an act of parliament, not by a treaty. The argument that Assange's team were making today was that, in fact, there have been many treaties, some ratified by Parliament going back over centuries, that contain this protection. Indeed, their claim is that it's an almost standard feature of extradition treaties that they have this caveat that you can't be extradited on political grounds. So clearly, they are hoping that that will persuade the two judges that there are matters here that are worth re-examining. Your correspondent is right also that they revisited the stories of the CIA plot to kill or kidnap Julian Assange, which are really, quite shocking stories. And it's worth remembering that they were originally researched by Yahoo, its news division, and they found 30 retired CIA operatives who corroborated some or all of their story, which I must say I thought at the time was an extraordinary number of sources to have for a story. I've written many stories with far fewer than 30. So, it was essentially an attempt to represent arguments we've heard before, but I thought they made a strong case today.
In terms of what would happen were Julian Assange to be extradited to the United States, Tim, do you feel he could face a fair trial over there? The prison term they're talking about is 175 years, which sounds baroque, but clearly it's an idea of what he would be facing were he to cross the Atlantic Ocean and face trial there.
Well, yes, there is. There is the potential sentence, and actually, I know that you hear this figure bandied about all of the time. There is effectively a manual in the United States penal arrangements that explains how each crime is tallied up, and we had this explained to us during the original extradition hearings, and it's really rather chilling. As people will know, there are 18 charges under the 17 charges under the Espionage Act and one other, and for each crime, he would get 5 years, and then there's a kind of 5-10 years, whatever, and then there's an extra portion added because it's political, an extra portion added because it's national security, an extra portion added because he's considered to be a flight risk. So yes, the prospect of a for the rest of your life sentence by European standards seems like something from medieval ages, and hard to think that is reasonable punishment, even if you think that Julian Assange has done the worst things. There are other concerns about a fair trial, though, because it would be heard in Virginia, in an area which is known to be the home for a great many senior American military families and security service families. And very few trials of this kind that have been heard in those courts have acquitted in national security cases. So I think there's a fairly strong case for saying that's an area of concern. And also, don't forget, there is extensive evidence that Assange's meetings with his lawyers were bugged while he was in the Ecuadorian embassy on the orders of the CIA. So in many instances, that alone, I think, would compromise the ability to have a fair trial. So certainly, if he is extradited, I would be feeling his prospects looked very bleak indeed, quite apart from the very real health concerns that we heard about today.
Indeed, his health concerns. Benedict Pavio, correspondent, saying that he wasn't well. Do you have any further insight on that?
Well, I don't, only to say that he has been present, I'm pretty sure, for every session up till now, or if he's missed one or two, it is really only that. And there have been weeks and weeks of proceedings. So I can't imagine that he missed those sessions lightly. I know that he broke a rib during a coughing fit around Christmas, which is a pretty extreme reaction to a coughing fit. And the couple of people I've spoken with who've visited him recently, who are not part of his inner circle, told me that they had concerns about his seeming distracted and taking a long time to answer questions. One colleague said that she saw him not long before Christmas, and whenever she put something to him, there was quite a long silence after her question. And whether that was his wariness or his sort of disassociation, she couldn't say for certain, but it didn't seem like the reactions of a healthy man.
Indeed. Tim, on a more general level, there are obviously journalists facing challenges in different countries where the rules, the laws, the constitutions of those countries, the approach of the governments, authoritarian or not, has a different take on what a journalist should and shouldn't do. You and I suspect, come from the English stable where there are laws that protect, and you can stand in a court and say, I'm not revealing my source, and you take the law in the face, and you have the right to do that, and you have the right to do that as a journalist, protect your source. I'm wondering what this case means for journalists worldwide. Will it indicate in some ways a different kind of treatment for journalists across the world? Given what you've been talking about, the CIA's involvement, this idea of bugging conversations on a third-party country's ground, Ecuador's embassy, those kind of issues. Do you think this will create a different way that journalists are dealt with and approached across the world?
I do. And to be perfectly honest, that's what has motivated my involvement in this. I didn't, during the glory days of the war logs and WikiLeaks, I mean, I paid them attention as a journalist, but I wasn't some sort of Assange fanboy. But when the charges were published and I looked at those, then I became very worried. Because while they're dressed up in the rather arcane language of the United States Espionage Act, the misnamed Espionage Act, it was in fact passed to try and suppress opposition to the First World War in America. The actions for which they're seeking to prosecute Julian Assange are of seeking out a source to wrongdoing and discreetly helping that source to pass information to somebody who intends to publish it, and then publishing it for general consumption. And those, it seems to me, are the actions that journalists undertake every day. If you think about many of the big stories that we will have watched or been involved with, MPs' expenses in this country, thalidomide, the Panama Papers, all of them involve somebody witnessing wrongdoing, feeling uncomfortable about it, and passing information to a journalist. And I think if Assange is convicted, then journalists all over the world, if they are offered security classified information, whatever it reveals, will find themselves thinking, do I want to risk 175 years in prison? Is this story worth it? Is it worth the risk? And I'm sure that, journalists are curmudgeonly and many very, very brave, and some won't be affected, but I think some will. So if he's convicted, if he goes to prison for the rest of his life, there are stories that we won't learn about that otherwise we would have done. And that worries me a great deal.
Tim Dawson, Deputy General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. Thank you, sir, for your time. Thank you for answering my questions, and thank you for your analysis of the situation facing Julian Assange and journalists across the world in the light of this case. Thank you, sir, very much indeed.
Great to see you.